Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the History Valley podcast. And today, Professor James Tabor joins us once again. Last time he was with us, he talked about the Waco tragedy. I'll have the link to that video in the description below, and to his YouTube channel, and to the first interview that he did with me last year as well, when we talked about his book, The Jesus Dynasty. Today, we're going to be talking about one of his other books, Paul and Jesus. He talks about how the reasons that Paul broke from the apostles, showing that there's a sharp disagreement between Paul and the other apostles of Jesus Christ. Some people try to say, actually, there's nothing to see here. But he shows in this book, yeah, these guys, Paul didn't really get along with these guys as much as some people think that he did. You see things of like Paul confronting Cephas to his face, or the arguments he had with James, or things like that. And then he goes into the Epistle of James, and what I find very interesting there is he shows that there's actually parallels between the Epistle of James and the Q document. And I actually want to ask you about that. What led to your, like, how should I put it? Okay. You've shown parallels between the Epistle of James and the teachings in the Q document, the Jesus teachings in the Q document. And what do you think the relationship is there between those two texts? And could that be involved in any way with Paul's disagreement with their theology?
Well, good to be with you, Jacob. Hold that a minute, because I'll tell you what I want to do that'll lead into that is I want to just say a few things about why I wrote this book that are more, kind of personal background. I actually, in fact, did my PhD dissertation on Paul, and that was in the 80s. So I've been studying Paul for 40 years. And lots of New Testament scholars, or scholars of, I call myself more ancient Mediterranean religions, really, but I focus on Second Temple Judaism and what people call Christian origins, which I consider a subset of Second Temple Judaism. That is, Paul's Jewish, Jesus is Jewish, the basic followers of Jesus are Jewish. And so I've been working on Paul for these 4 decades. And that was my dissertation. I've republished that in a version that's now updated and so forth, called Paul's Ascent to Paradise. And we might do that in the future. That's on Paul's his spirituality, his mysticism. Was he a Gnostic? Where is his religion coming from? Setting him in the context of what we call Hellenistic religions. But this book is very much down the line of, as you indicate, talking about Paul and James and how people interpret the significance of Paul. But if you'll permit it here, I'd like to start with reading you a couple paragraphs from the opening of the book, the preface, because I think it sets the stage for what is behind everything that I did in the book, including your initial question about the Q document. I said, I have spent now this was 10 years ago, so I've spent my 30-year career as a scholar of Christian origins, investigating the silence between 2 back-to-back statements of the Apostles' Creed. If you remember, the Apostles' Creed is one of the earliest post-New Testament creeds. We have some creeds embedded, maybe even in the letters of Paul, but beyond that. Namely, that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, crucified, died, and was buried, and on the 3rd day he rose again from the dead. Now, what I said is I'm investigating the silence between born of the Virgin Mary, crucified, dead, and buried, and raised. Is it not striking that this oldest and most foundational Christian creed jumps from Jesus' birth to his death and resurrection entirely skipping over his life.
Hmm.
Think about that.
Yeah.
This is the central confession of the earliest second century Christians. And as they confess, they don't really talk about the silence between. He's born and he dies. How did it happen that the way Jesus came into the world and how he left, virgin birth, resurrection, ascent to heaven, Christmas and Easter, came to define Christianity? Here, Catholics, Protestants, and evangelicals all agree. To be a Christian, you believe in the virgin birth and resurrection of Christ and participate in the salvation Christ brought to the world. And what I go on to say is I think that kind of view of what it is to be a Christian or to follow Jesus, birth and death, is essentially a creation of Paul. Now, if you go to James, you mentioned James, or the collection of the sayings of Jesus that scholars sometimes call Q. This is a designation given in Germany about 150 years ago. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Notice the book of James doesn't mention Jesus' birth. And it alludes to his death, perhaps in terms of the death of a righteous man, a just one. But remember, James is called the just one, and he dies. And John the Baptist is considered in Q. Among those born of women, there's none greater than John, greater probably in righteousness, just in significance. And he was beheaded.
Yeah.
And so James, it's not as though he's not aware of the death of Jesus, but he doesn't say, look, your faith is essentially the virgin birth and the death of Jesus and his blood on the cross, and that's what saves you. Never mentions the blood on the cross, never mentions the cross. So the book of James, whether it came exactly from James or not, like modern scholars would not think that it's an autograph from James. We're actually not sure where it comes from, but it has his name on it. It's in Greek, and if there was maybe a Hebrew version of it, it might have come from, at least if you wanted to be, more conservative, at least than most scholars, from the circles of James, or it's reflecting a way of being religious, or a way of following Jesus that is quite different from that of Paul. Now, contrast that with what Paul says to the Corinthians, for example, who have all kinds of problems, these Greeks. He said, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. He does mention Jesus is born of a woman, but essentially Paul's gospel is the gospel of the cross of Christ. Now, what would be James's gospel? What was the message? Or gospel is probably not the best term in English, but the positive message, the good news, or the announcement. What is it that James would think is being announced, by being part of this messianic movement? Since he doesn't even mention the birth or death of Jesus or the cross, if the book is supposed to represent that, that must not be so central to him. So that would be one of the differences. Not just like, can we find them fighting in Galatians, or are there hints that Paul might have questioned the authority of James and the other so-called pillars of the church? By the way, he's the one who uses that term, the so-called pillars of the church. Those who seem to be pillars of the church, as if he's over here looking at them and saying, well, they seem to think they're in charge, but actually, then he says, what they are means nothing to me. Now, I think there's a context to that. He's not completely dissing them as having no value whatsoever. But the context is, I got my message straight from Jesus. And if even an angel comes and preaches anything different, much less James or Peter, an angel comes, Or even if I come and say, you know what I used to tell you, I've learned some new things. Don't believe what I used to tell you. He said, you should tell me, it's the word anathema, and it really means what we would say today, go to hell. Just go to hell with that. It's very strong. That's in Galatians. If we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel other than this cross message. So I want to start with that in answering your question, because it really has to do with, isn't it interesting how it hooks into the very opening page of the book, that Christianity came to be this creedal confession of the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, Christmas and Easter, two main holidays. And yet we find in the book of James, or the letter of James, that's not the emphasis. So what is the emphasis? It's literally it's a prophetic, or let me put it this way, not prophetic in the adjectival sense, but it is the view of true religion based upon the Hebrew prophets. It basically is the question, what does God really require of humans? It's a universal question. Micah, I'm talking about Micah, Amos, Hosea, these ringing prophets that talk about justice and righteousness. So what does James end up talking about? Pay your wages to your workers, right? Be just, give them a fair wage. Here's the guy talking about what we would call today minimum wage. Should somebody work 40 hours a week and take their measly paycheck home and they can't even pay their rent or their basic necessities of food and utilities? You say, well, that's not really, everybody would consider it sort of part of Christianity, but James mentions it. He talks about all kinds of ethical things that remind you of what most people probably call the Sermon on the Mount. That's just in their head. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek. When you pray, don't do it to be seen of other people. You've got this whole body of material, several hundred sayings of Jesus that are now found in two versions, Matthew and Luke. They're not in Mark. The definition of Q, the formal definition, is the sayings material of Jesus that is parallel in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So you can actually just pull it out and look at it. And when you look at it, what do you find? It's primarily like in Luke chapter 6 and 7 and Matthew 5, 6, 7, and then it's some scattered throughout. It's primarily these ethical teachings of the kind of spirituality that you would find reflected in the Hebrew prophets. What is God really looking at? Things like God looks at the internal, not the external. Now, that's found in other places outside of Q. For example, Mark tells a story about a widow in the temple, and she's got 3 strikes against her in that culture. She's a woman. She's a widow without a marriage or a man because her husband's died, and she doesn't have any money. I call it the 3 M's. The man, she's not a man, she's not male, she's not married, and she doesn't have money. So what is she in that culture? 0. Absolutely not, just supposed to take care of widows. That's about it. But in Mark, this is in Mark 12, I believe, Jesus says, did you guys notice that woman who put in the 2 famous, copper coins called the lepton? I've actually found those at archaeological digs that I've done in Jerusalem. It's a small coin it's about the 4th the size of a penny, of an actual penny. And Jesus says she gave more than all of these people. And right before that, he had told a scribe, probably a Pharisee, the great commandment is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what do we find in the prophets? And what do we find in the book of James? Love God, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and love your fellow human as yourself. And if you remember in Mark, the guy that hears it says, yes, if you did that, we wouldn't even need this temple, all these sacrifices. And then right after that, he talks about the widow. So what you're getting here is this emphasis not on buildings, not on temples, not on external things like praying loud prayers so that people will hear them and so forth, but internal things. And it runs all the way through Q, it runs through the Gospels. Now, I think Paul buys into some of that, but if you ask him, what is your message? What is your core? What's the gospel? He would say it's that Jesus died for your sins and was raised, and through faith in him, you're forgiven of your sins. So it's just a kind of a different emphasis. Apostles' Creed, Paul, Q, and James on the other side. And so the book has a lot to do with that sort of thing. It questions, I wrote down, we can talk about any of these, but they're kind of five claims that the book makes. One is that Paul never met Jesus. He might have seen him once. He's in Jerusalem when Jesus dies. He might have seen him from a distance being crucified, for all I know. But there's no record of him ever saying, yeah, I saw Jesus and we had a conversation, or I either liked him or hated him or whatever. So his sole claim to authority is his clairvoyant visionary experience. Today we call that apparitions. He had visions. Now, when I wrote this book, I didn't want it to be a Paul bashing book or a Paul lauding book, because my goal was to get Paul right. And you know what I found? Conservative, believing Christians, more what we would call evangelical, even fundamentalists, for the most part, they love this book. And also people that don't like Paul very much, or they just don't identify with Paul in terms of their own Christian faith, if they are Christian, they also like this book. So how could this be true? Maybe because I got him right. In other words, on that first point, if you're kind of critical of Paul, you'd say, no, wait a minute, he never even met Jesus. Shouldn't we go more by what Jesus taught and what people that knew Jesus taught, like James, his own brother, or Peter, who was with him, Cephas or Cephas, rather than the visionary experience of somebody who never actually met him? And how do we know how to credit that visionary experience? That's one of the problems, you see. The second is, from a historical point of view, and this goes to this whole creedal thing, this has been suggested by many people, but I think I buy into this. If you understand Christianity as the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed and the creeds of the Christian church, then Paul's the founder of Christianity, not Jesus. Because Jesus, he doesn't. I'll give you an example, and this is in Luke. Jesus talks about two men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and he said, I thank God that I'm not like other men. I pray, I fast. He's naming all these things he does. Not like this sinner over here. And the other man is a tax collector, remember? And he won't even lift his head. He feels very unworthy, and he strikes his breast and he says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, no cross, no blood of Christ, no Christianity. Of course, it was before that. But the point is, Jesus says, which one went up justified before God? Justified, declared forgiven. And it was very clear that it was the one who humbled himself. So you get these kind of things. Whereas Christianity became creedal. Like if you don't confess the right doctrines, then you're not a Christian, and this Christian group is ostracizing this group. So the first big controversy was the Arians, who said Jesus was not eternally existent, but a created being. And the Trinitarians or Nicene people who said, no, he's eternal with the Father and so forth. So there's a sense in which Paul could be called the founder of Christianity, if you understand Christianity as this creedal confessional Christianity, see? But what if you understand Christianity as trying to revive an internalized new covenant understanding of the Torah, as James did, and as I think Jesus did, then would that really be Christianity in the sense of a new religion? Or would it be an attempt to get Jews and Gentiles to emphasize following the God of Israel? The third point in the book is you should read the New Testament backwards. I know you know this, you do shows on it all the time.
Yeah.
But people start reading Matthew because it's first, and then they get to Mark and they think they've already read it because they think, oh, this is just a short version of Matthew, which absolutely is not. I know you had a show on the priority of Matthew. I'd be glad to come and talk about that.
Sure.
Because I completely disagree with the gentleman you interviewed.
Yeah, Jonathan Sheffield.
Yeah, I believe absolutely Mark is prior. And
I
think
agree.
it can easily be shown that Matthew always edits and redacts and generally shortens and truncates his version of Mark. But anyway, my point is most people read that and maybe they make it through Luke, which is quite a slog because it's pretty long, 28 chapters. And then they get to John, and if they're pious Christians, they kind of like John because he talks about light and darkness and believing and faith, and it seems familiar to them. It's more creedal. But you should read it the other way. The first letter, the first book you should read if you want to study Christianity is First Thessalonians. It's the earliest document. I'm not saying you have to read the New Testament chronologically, but at least recognize that by the time you get to the Gospels, they're heavily influenced by Paul.
Right.
So if there's a version of Christianity already preserved in like James and the Q source, which is prior to the formation of the Gospels, this collection of the sayings of Jesus. I don't care if people call it Q. You hear people today argue like, well, I don't believe in Q. This Q theory is crazy. Then don't call it Q. Would you agree that Matthew and Luke have a set of about 250 sayings of Jesus in common that are not in Mark? You'd have to agree with that because they do. So why do you need to, don't name it anything, just say the collection of sayings that Matthew and Luke have in common that's not in Mark. But I can then read those sayings, and what is the content of those sayings? It's not the heart and soul of Paul's gospel. It's more like how to live and how to pray and how to give. And we have other sayings that fit in with that. You're familiar with the Didache. Very important document that has finally been discovered in the 19th century in a monastery in Greece. And I'm glad we have it because it was mentioned in various church fathers. And now we have several manuscripts of the Didache. And even there you find in the opening chapters of the Didache some sayings of Jesus that are not in the New Testament. But as soon as you hear them, they have this kind of ring that reminds you of the way Jesus talks in the Q verses, let's call them, or the Q source or whatever, the saying source. We'll just call it the saying source. For example, one of my favorite is, if you're going to give money to God, like a contribution, picture somebody sitting in church or whatever, going up to the temple, giving an offering, let your money sweat in your hands until you know to whom you give it. I love it. It's a great little saying. It parallels, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. See how similar it is? It's the idea, I want to give something. Instead of announcing it or flapping the $100 bill around like a big tip, like I'm going to get it, just hold it in your hand. And how long should I hold it? Hold it till it sweats, meaning you need to be thinking, who are you giving it to? What is it really for? Why are you giving it? This is just, I'm not preaching to you here. I like this stuff actually, but all I'm really saying is, look how that coheres with the kind of thing that you find in the Gospels and in James. There's this body of teaching. Now, Paul has some of that. Paul has ethics. He has some very moving passages about loving enemies and suffering for others and considering other people. I'm not putting him out the door in terms of being an ethical teacher. But when people come to formulate Christianity, you need to realize that Paul wrote first, and all those doctrines got set. You know, what is the gospel? How are you saved? How does a person obtain justification, which means a right standing with God? And you're going to find that the answer Paul gives is different than the answer you find in James and in the Gospels, where you simply turn to God like in the prophets, and you repent and pray and ask God to forgive you. And so I have a chapter called Reading the New Testament Backwards, just to remind people that when they read the Gospels, they might be reading outside of the older material in the Gospels. They might be reading as much of Paul as they are of Jesus. And I also make the point that Paul's maybe the most influential person in history. I know that is usually going to go to Jesus or Moses or the Buddha, probably Jesus, if you judge influence just by sheer, numbers or whatever, it would be Jesus. But if the Jesus you're getting is primarily filtered through Paul, then maybe Paul is the most influential person in history. We don't have to take a vote on that. And finally, this is big all the way through the book, and we can talk about it all you want. Paul is radically apocalyptic. There's no way to get around it. He believes that what he calls the form of the cosmos, the schema means the way things are operating in the creation, the physical creation, is passing away right now. And then he also has a phrase, this is 1 Corinthians 7, the appointed time has grown very short. And then he begins to tell people, look, all the normal relationships that you expect to have, like marriage, and maybe you're going to go into business, or maybe economic and social relationships, male, female, slave free, all of that matters nothing, because it's all going to be transformed very soon. And I think he would add, and you will live to see it, most likely. He certainly thought he was going to live to see it. And he's probably 50 years old or so when he's writing these things, judging just from the chronology we can reconstruct. And he thinks he's going to live to see it. So unless you see Paul, and I would say Jesus too, but Paul, we've got his letters, at least the 7 letters that most of us think are pretty non-interpolated. They're pretty much from the pen of Paul. You can't understand those unless you keep in mind that it is like 11:55 before midnight. And midnight is the coming of Christ, the judgment, the end of the age, and so forth. And Paul, resurrection of the dead. And he believes that. So what Schweitzer called interim ethics, how do you live 5 minutes before the end of history? And I'm just using the clock as an analogy, 5 minutes before midnight, meaning you're going to see it come, and it is going to strike midnight. It's really quick, so you don't have a lot of time to get your affairs in order. That's also a big factor in Paul. So a lot of what people draw from Paul and quote, you're going to find it needs to be contextualized by the fact that he thought it was the end of the age. You could ask things like, I don't want to go too far astray here, but we'll get back to your questions.
Sure, it's fine.
Did Paul condone slavery? Say, well, yeah, he does tell slaves, if you're a slave, just be a slave. Well, if it's 5 minutes till midnight, I can be a slave. And he says, you're free in Christ. But what he expects is there's not going to be any slavery very soon, right? And the same thing with marriage. If you get married, what have you bought into? You bought into an obsolete arrangement between genders, and there's not even going to be any genders. There's neither male nor female in Christ. And yet people are sitting there and say, well, I'm female, I'm male. What are you talking about? He's talking about the transformation is so near. And, in Luke, it's chapter 20, I think, going back to Jesus, he says something very similar when people ask him about divorce and remarriage. And a woman might, if she had a husband and then another husband and another husband, who's going to be her husband in the resurrection? He says, you don't have any, I'm paraphrasing, he says, you don't have any idea what resurrection is. There's not male or female. There's not marriage. It's completely transformed. So he tells people not to get married. Well, try extending that for 2,000 years. Are all Christians, followers of Jesus, supposed to be celibate? So you have to always read Paul in the context of the form of this world is presently, right now, present tense in Greek, passing away, meaning it's already shifting. He believed that the creation of Genesis 1 was going to be fundamentally transformed and altered very soon, and that his generation would live to see it. So the book, those are some of the premises that everything in the book is based on. Now, why do people who love Paul like the book, and people who don't like Paul, maybe even hate Paul, like the book? Because they would say, yeah, Paul never met Jesus. He had visions from Jesus, and I believe they were true visions, and therefore I'm fine with that, you see? Whereas someone else would say, Paul never met Jesus, so what he was saying, how do we know if it's even from Jesus? How would you possibly believe or verify when people are talking about visionary experience? Like, I went up to heaven and I heard things unutterable, which he says. What if you were just having a deluded apparition of some type? Why? Whereas James or Peter would say, well, I've spent countless hours with Jesus, face to face, touching him, knowing him. And I'm telling you that he's this way and this way. And Paul said, well, I actually never met him, but I do talk to him. He actually says that he hears a voice, and it's Jesus. He identified it. He says, he has some kind of physical ailment, we think, and calls it his thorn in the flesh. He calls it a messenger of Satan. And he says, I asked the Lord is Jesus. I asked the Lord 3 times if he would help me. And he said, 3 times he answered, and he quotes the answer like a quote. We call that clairvoyance, when you're actually hearing from the spirit being, you claim you are. So it just has to be recognized that there's a difference there. Some people would affirm that, and others would say, well, that makes me have some second thoughts about Paul. So if Paul is right in what he says, then you probably will like my book. And if you don't think he's right, then you'll probably like my book if I get Paul right. I think I get him right. I mean, I certainly try to. I'm trying to tell you what Paul says, not whether I think it's right or not, or even whether you should think it's right or not, but what does he say? So yes, you asked me, does he call Peter, Cephas, and James? Does he say, I went up to Jerusalem and I met with the so-called pillars of the church. What they are means nothing to me. Yeah, he says that. So I want to point that out. Those who trust Paul's visionary experience would say, yeah, of course, because Paul actually has something later than any of the apostles, because they only knew Jesus, as Paul says, in the flesh. They knew the human Jesus, but Paul would say, I know the divine Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
So that is a long preface to getting at the issues that you talk about. And of course, the big question then is, does he actually break with them? Does he make a definitive break with these?
Well, it's kind of like in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, when he says there are those that follow me, there are those that follow Cephas or John or Christ. And I find it interesting that he says Christ at the end there. Like, if there's those that follow Christ, I'm like, does that mean they're followers of Christ? are not followers of Paul. And I think that fits in what you're saying, that Paul follows the visionary Jesus, the heavenly Jesus, and these guys are following the physical Jesus in that sense. At least that's.
And I think it's reflected, again, we go back to the book of James, whoever wrote it and however we got it, it is what it is. And Jesus is, you can take out the word Jesus, it's in the first verse, and then it's, he also has, he mentions Jesus once more when he talks about the synagogue, Jewish synagogue, Messianic synagogue. I don't mean that in the modern sense of Messianic synagogue. It's like Jews for Jesus, but believers in Jesus that are meeting together, they call it a synagogue. And he says, don't hold the faith of our Lord, of God and our Lord Jesus in vain. He just mentions, but if you take out those two references to Jesus, everything in James stands and reads perfectly well without Jesus. Isn't that amazing? Try taking Jesus out of any letter of Paul. Will it read perfectly okay? It won't even make any sense. I rest my case. So you can take, you see the point? Two verses. You say, well, why would you remove Jesus from James? I'm not removing it. I'm just making the point. Of course, he knows his brother and honors his brother, but he doesn't develop a whole religion around his brother and the person of his brother, but rather, I take it, what he learned or also taught that would be like his brother. In other words, ethical teachings of what people usually call the Hebrew prophets. You know, you see it in Jeremiah, you see it in Micah, particularly Amos. The question I started with, well, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly before God. What about believing in Jesus and being baptized and taking the Lord's Supper? Well, that comes later. You see the idea? Not making fun of it. I'm just saying the Q material, it's not very Christological in that Pauline sense. Now, there is talk about a son of man, but that's a huge subject that we probably shouldn't get into today, but some other time. We could talk about, you know, Christology. How does it develop? Christology is like the different views of Jesus. But to go back to your quote from 1 Corinthians, some say I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow Cephas, I follow Christ. Could be that the Christ faction is like the James faction, saying we follow the original Jesus, although some scholars have suggested they might be the most arrogant of the group, thinking that their visions of Christ are their guide. Because as he goes into 1 Corinthians, he begins to talk about these spiritual gifts and how that group is going crazy with all kinds of things where people are ecstatically uttering things in the spirit, claiming that Christ says this and Christ says that. So he could even be referring to what we call the charismatic members of the group, as they tend to be called, you know, who are kind of saying, oh, you follow Peter. Well, I follow Christ because I just talked to him this morning, you know, that kind of idea. So there could, I mean, that's been suggested by a lot of New Testament scholars that they might be more, that sounds good. You say, I follow Christ, so that must be good. But what if they're making up their own visions and revelations, you see? So, but definitely you have different versions of the faith. That's one of the great results of the last 100 years of New Testament studies, and particularly the last 50 years, is that many, many hundreds of us have been working on aspects of this body of material that we have from the first century, now mostly in the New Testament, a few things like the Didache that are early, maybe the Gospel of Thomas, but very few sources outside the New Testament. And we poured over it, and probably the biggest conclusion is the movement is extremely diverse within 20, 30, 40 years. It's already branching out into these different ways. And Paul would be our earliest witness of that. So if you think of it as ways of being religious. Now what happens, Jacob, is that a guy we don't know his name, he's called traditionally Luke, but the guy who wrote Luke Acts, he is very interesting because when he comes to the second volume of his work, and it is anonymous, he never gives his name, even though traditionally he's called Luke. So let's just call it the writer of, it's kind of comical. The writer of what we now call Luke Acts, whatever his name was, he gets, in chapter 1, he mentions the 11 apostles, Judas is dead, and then they elect a new one to replace Judas. His name is Matthias. So they got 12. And then he says, and Mary and Jesus' brothers were there too when they did this. Mary and Jesus' brothers. Huh. That's interesting. That's the fleshly Jesus. That's the Jesus family, right? We talked about that.
Yeah.
Then you go back in Luke chapter 4, where Mark names the brothers in order. James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude. And guess what? Luke doesn't name the brothers. He just says the family. And he doesn't name the brothers in chapter 1. So then we get to chapter 15, which is the most critical point in the history of the movement, according to the book of Acts. It's all going to fall apart if they don't get agreement on what to do with the non-Jews. Are we going to accept non-Jews into this Jewish messianic movement called the Nazarenes? Probably is the best name for them. And they decide they will. But notice in Acts 15, Peter stands up and speaks. Yes, we should accept them. Paul stands up. Yes, we should accept them. They don't take a vote. James, first time his name is mentioned, James stands up, and what does he say? I picture him going like this. Okay, we've heard it all, and I have made my decision. This is what we're going to do. You go like, who are you? Paul's talking to Jesus. Peter was with Jesus, and you're deciding what we're going to do. Who are you? Now, isn't it funny? He doesn't say James, the brother of Jesus. I don't know what he wanted his readers to think 100 years from after he wrote, when they wouldn't even know Jesus had brothers, because Mary's going to become a perpetual virgin. So he can't have any brothers. So who's this James? Well, then finally we get down to Acts chapter 21. Paul goes up to Jerusalem again. And he meets, first thing, he goes in and sees James. Doesn't say the brother, it's James. Why would he go see James? Who's this James? Well, we can put it all together. It's Jesus' brother, and he's in charge of the whole movement. And so James says to Paul, people are saying you don't keep the Torah. You're a Jew. And remember, we decided Gentiles don't have to take up the yoke of the Torah. It's called the yoke of the Torah. It's like what Jews would say today, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. Like, you don't have to do that as a Gentile. You do not have to become Jewish. You do not have to convert to Judaism. You can live the life of what was called a God-fearer, a righteous Gentile. Prophets say the same thing. The righteous, and the rabbis say it, for the righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. That's a quote from the Mishnah. The righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. So all through the prophets is the teaching that the whole world will be judged by the one God who's the creator. So anyway, James says, we've heard that, Paul, you're a Jew, but we've just heard rumors that you may not be keeping the Torah yourself, even though you're Jewish. And obviously, if you're Jewish, you absolutely must keep the Torah, because, you're Jewish. And we're not talking about Gentiles. You're not a Gentile. And in order that everybody would know this isn't true, this rumor, we need you to do this, this, and this. It had to do with some very very ritualistic activities in the temple, the Herodian temple, where you pay for some men who have taken what's called a Nazarite vow, nothing to do with Nazarene, Nazirite. It's this vow of separation where you grow your hair long and you don't drink any wine and you can't go to a funeral and so forth. And you set a certain time, like I'm going to do this for a year. I'm going to do this for 5 years. John the Baptist is one person who had this vow apparently. And we know Samuel had it in the book of Samuel. That's where you first read about it. It's in the Torah. So he says, well, you go in the temple and you pay for these guys and people will then see you in the temple and then they'll know, oh, well, that can't be true that Paul doesn't keep the law because here he is like supporting some gentlemen that are offering sacrifices and keeping the law and so forth. So what Acts does, the book we call Acts, is it doesn't really let you know much about who this James is, right? And he's really in charge, even though he has to admit he's in charge. He's honest enough with the story. He has to admit he's in charge because he goes, my decision is, that's James. Okay. But he implies there's complete harmony. Paul's in harmony with James and Peter's in harmony with Paul, and they all met together and everybody agreed. And then we read Paul's letter of Galatians, and he gives his own version of that story. And he does say they gave me the right hand of fellowship. But whether Paul agreed with them in terms of what Jews must do is very questionable. In other words, what James is saying, we know, Paul, that you would not, as a Jew, disregard the Torah. And Paul just goes, according to the account, I don't know what happened historically, but it's like if I said to you, Jacob, somebody said you did this, this, and this, and I know you didn't do that. And you're thinking, yeah, I did. And I go, but I know you didn't. So would you go do this so that people will know you don't do that? And you go, yeah, I'll do it. He went along with it. He didn't want to rock the boat. Well, it's possible that that has some historical truth to it, because Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 9, to the Jew, I become as a Jew. Very interesting language. What do you mean you become as a Jew? You are a Jew. How could you say become as a Jew? And then he says, to those under the law, that would be the Jewish, those that are Jewish, they're, quote, under the jurisdiction of the Torah. They're supposed to keep the commandments of the Torah, right? He says, I become as if I'm under the Torah. What do you mean, as if you're under the Torah? You're a Jew, you're under the Torah. He just said, but what he's saying, I've heard people say, oh, he's a hypocrite. No, I wouldn't use that word. He believes that this is all passing away very quickly. It's not even going to be a Torah. There's going to be a new age, a new spiritual age. Half the laws have to do with eating and drinking and male and female and bodily things that won't even apply in any way in the world to come, because there's going to be this transformed cosmos that's going to be spiritual and eternal, right? And so I don't really like the word, Paul's being hypocritical. And then he goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 9, and to the Gentiles, those who aren't under the law, I become as one not under the law. Well, what does that mean? Would he eat food that was forbidden for Jews to eat? Possibly. He tells his Gentile followers that in Romans 14 and so forth, just eat what's set before you, don't ask questions. And he says this in several places in his letters. So I don't see it as hypocritical as much as Paul thinks it's all irrelevant, but you have to not rock the boat in the present situation. As he says, give no offense, neither to Jews or Gentiles or the Church of God. Those are the three spectrums that he deals with. So don't offend Gentiles, try to accommodate them and deal with them. Don't offend Jews that aren't in the movement. If you're Jewish, you You're in a Jewish home, you go by Jewish rules and Jewish laws. You don't just flaunt your freedom, as he calls it, right in their face and offend them, you know. And if you're in the Church of God, which he is, he tries to go along with things. It's a real principle that runs through Paul's letters, sort of accommodating for the needs of the people that you're dealing with. Now, I don't know any way that James would agree with that. You know, can you picture James or somebody like James saying, I'm Jewish, but, you know, when I'm around non-Jews, it's like I'm not really under the law anymore because I want to relate to them. So my guess is that Paul thinks that most of these things, particularly as he says in Galatians, if they had to do with food and drink, festivals, new moons, the Sabbath, he says these are all bodily, you know, these are all things that have to do with our living in the world right now. He's not particularly interested in those, but he doesn't want to offend people that might have scruples about these things. So now that book, that becomes his, I would call it a strategic way of dealing with people rather than hypocritical. It's his strategy. And if he had to defend it, he would say, look, I want the good of everybody. And I'm not going to offend people and turn them away from what he thought was the gospel by flouting in their face something that they wouldn't understand. So he's situational, what people later call situational ethics. So if a perfect example is in Corinthians, what if I go to the makelon? That's the Greek word for the market. And by the way, in Corinth, and I've excavated at Corinth a little bit, not a lot, mostly in Israel and Jordan, but years ago I spent some time in Corinth excavating, and I didn't find this. This was long before I was there. They found the plaque that went over the meat market. You can read part of the letters. It's fascinating to look at. It says makel, you know, like makelon. So Paul refers to the meat market. Every city has a meat market where you buy your meat. And he says, I silenced my phone, but it's buzzing. I'll put it over here. So anyway, he says, you know, somebody goes to the meat market and buys meat and takes it home. They do eat meat. And then somebody says, well, you know, this morning that meat was sanctified and slaughtered at the Temple of Athena up on the Acropolis. I do not feel we should eat that meat because not only are we supporting the meat business, you know, of the sacrificial business, but we are maybe partaking of idolatry because it was dedicated to Athena. Paul's idea is like, yeah, you got a point. I'm not going to eat it if that's how you feel. But if you feel, you know, who cares? Athena is nothing. He says an idol's nothing. If you feel an idol's nothing, I don't care who they do it. They devoted it to Athena. Athena doesn't even exist. Athena is a mythological idea of Greek culture. So it was really dedicated to nothing. So what's wrong with it? Eat it. Doesn't matter. You see how he's situational. Now, strict Jews are not going to go in a Gentile city and buy meat from a Gentile market that's been, you know, dedicated to a pagan deity. They're just not going to do that. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that you see Paul operating with. There's a method to his, I think there's usually a consistency in what he does, but what he does will not always be the same thing. It depends on the situation. So we call that situational ethics. It depends. And I think probably we can find versions of that in the teachings of Jesus, where he is accused by the Pharisees of his disciples were pulling some grain off the stalks while they were walking one day on the Sabbath and just popping it in their mouth, eating. And this is in Mark chapter 2. And the Pharisees would definitely consider that a violation of the Sabbath. And also the Dead Sea Scroll group. It's actually mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls that you must prepare your food before the Sabbath. They didn't prepare their food before the Sabbath, so they're violating the Sabbath. That's a command of the Torah. And Jesus ends up by saying at the end, he has an answer, which I'll talk about in a minute. But at the end, he says, if you had understood what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you wouldn't have condemned the guiltless. He's saying they're guiltless. Now, how are they guiltless? Technically, they're not guiltless because they prepared their food by grabbing the grain and eating on the Sabbath. But in Mark, Jesus doesn't just try to say, oh, it's okay if they want to pick a little grain and eat it. He doesn't say that. He goes, well, look at King David. In the Hebrew Bible, he and his men are hungry. They're starving. They've been out in the desert. And they come to the tent of meeting, which is the version of the tabernacle before they built the building. And they tell the priest, get the bread out of the inside of the temple or tent. It's called the bread of the presence. It's these 12 loaves of bread that only the priest can eat, according to the Torah. Nobody else can eat it, just priest. It's holy bread. It's like, to Christians, it'd be like the communion wafers, that are stored in the back of the church, for Holy Communion. He goes, go get those communion wafers. I'm hungry. You go like, you can't have that. That's like not for that. And the priests, if David wants it, they're probably afraid to say no, so they go get it. And to paraphrase basically what Jesus is saying, so you think my disciples are breaking the law, right? Picking this grain on the Sabbath. Well, guess what? David broke the law. So maybe we are breaking the law, but you know what? The Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. So what is he doing there? He's saying you got to judge it according to human need. So Paul has that same kind of idea. He's situational. What is the human context in which you make a decision? See? So people have rigid views, this is the command and you got to do this and there's no veering to the right or left. And then there are others who would say, well, it just depends on the circumstance. I mean, the famous story the rabbis always tell is modern rabbis about the Nazis looking for Anne Frank in Amsterdam. And they knock on the door and they're going house to house. We hear that some Jews are hiding in attics and they're being sheltered, and we want to search your house. And do you have any, you need to tell us now, because if we find you're lying, you're going to get arrested as well. Do you have any Jews in your attic? And that family was asked that. This is actually true. And they go, no, we don't have anybody. And they got a whole family up in their attic. So they lied. So, well, lying is forbidden. You shall not bear false witness. That is one of the 10 commandments. And everybody, I think, would say, it's just common sense.
And they lied to protect those people.
Yes, of course. And it's actually in the Bible, there's a famous story in the Bible where Rahab, the prostitute, is hiding these spies in Jericho. And when the city men they hear that they're at her house, and they break down the door and they run upstairs and they go, were those guys here? Were they here? Where are they? Where are they? And she goes, yeah, they were here, but they already left. And she's got them hidden, actually. But she's like, they went that way just to get them to leave. So she's lying. And she's actually mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew as one of the ancestors of Jesus, through the line, the Davidic line. Her ancestry leads down to Boaz and down to Jesse and down to King David. So it's interesting. I've got that delivery. I see a delivery person. Can you pause it again? And you be thinking of where we want to go, because this is a good. Okay, you go ahead.
Okay, we're on.
So whatever, that essentially would make the points that I was making. So I'm going to throw it back to you with some of the things you were wanting to ask.
Sure. Why do you think that Paul avoids ever mentioning the people that were directly responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus? That is the Romans. He always says, it's the rulers of the age. And well, in 1 Thessalonians, he blames the Jews for Jesus' death. But in 1st, 2nd Corinthians, it's the rulers of the age, or Satan, who is behind the rulers of the age. Because there are people out there, another reason I'm asking this question is that there are people out there that are often the same people that say the Q document don't exist. Ironically, they're the same people that think. They go as far as saying Jesus didn't exist, mythicists, and they'll say, "Oh, look at these epistles. It's all happening in heaven. It's not on earth. Paul doesn't know about an earthly Jesus." So, what do you think about that?
He clearly has this perspective that, as he puts it, Satan is the god of the world, of the lower realm. He has this is actually covered quite a bit in here, because here I deal with Paul's cosmos, and what he thinks is there are these levels. This is very typical of the Hellenistic world. There are these levels of heaven, of the heavens, and there's 7 of them. They're the planetary spheres, and these planetary spheres are populated by what are translated in English the principalities and the powers. You talk about heights and depths. Depths is the lower world, the world of the dead. Heights is all the way up to the 7th heaven. Now, God and the angels, the messengers of God, they dwell beyond even the 7th heaven. They're out of this lower material world. It's quasi-Gnostic, actually, but it's typical Hellenistic cosmology. So the Romans down below, who actually had Jesus crucified, he alludes to, as you say, in 1 Corinthians, the powers of the age and so forth. They're just pawns in the game. And I think he does tend to blame, at least some people think it's an interpolation, but in 1 Thessalonians, he talks about the Jews who oppose him and oppose his followers. And he says, and they kill the Lord Jesus Christ. So there you go, the famous deicide charge, the Jewish people killed Jesus. In the Gospels, particularly Matthew's the strongest on this, but all of them say it. It's the Jewish crowds, even though Pontius Pilate, the governor, or the ruler, procurator of Judea, delivers him over. I wouldn't go with the idea so much that he doesn't think Jesus was literally crucified or anything like that. He's heavenly in the sense that he thinks the earthly, which he accepts the reality of, I think, politically and socially, is being completely run and manipulated by higher forces. And in the traditions of ascending to heaven, which is, again, what my book is about, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, it's very dangerous to do this. You can get zapped really easy. You have no idea what you're dealing with. We have the Greek magical papyri, particularly what's called the Mithras liturgy, which is from the great Paris magical papyri. And I translate it in this book and talk about it. And you got to be prepared, both in terms of your knowledge and your negotiating power, to deal with these principalities and powers. So Paul believes that Christ has ascended up through all of these spheres and is the first one to make it through and achieve the glorification of God beyond all the heavens. and that his spirit and power is now enabling his followers to resist the devil and so forth. But he's really just saturated with the idea that anything that happens is caused by these forces. For example, I mentioned earlier his quote, thorn in the flesh. Okay, he uses that term, thorn in the flesh, like something physical bothering him. But he says, an angel of Satan. He calls it an angel of Satan, a messenger of Satan, like Satan is doing this. One time he's talking about making a trip to the Corinthians, I believe it is. He says, I planned to come, I had all my travel plans, but Satan hindered me. What do you mean Satan hindered it? Maybe the boat, like that you had booked, it got delayed, or there was a storm, or anything that happens, he would attribute it to these forces and powers. When there was a guy living with his father's wife sexually. I don't think it's his mother. Doesn't make sense in the context that it's his mother. Probably could be the father is either divorced or widowed. Let's say he's widowed. The father, let's say the father's dead and now the woman is a widow. I should say the woman. And the son marries the woman that was his stepmother. Paul is just appalled by this. Says it's incestuous, it should never be. Even he says even pagans don't do that. But what I'm leading up to is not that and why he would make that judgment. But rather he says deliver him to Satan. He says assemble together. And when you are all assembled together, and then he says something very, and my spirit is present and the spirit of the Lord Jesus. So he actually believes I'm going to project my spirit and your spirit, and the Jesus spirit will be there, and you're going to formally deliver him to Satan. So they had some kind of thing, like probably some pronouncement, like we now cast you out of our group, and you're not to eat or talk to anyone, and he says don't even eat with a person, don't give them any kind of recognition, ostracizing them. Later Christians call it disfellowshipping, but this is very severe. But he says to Satan. So he thinks of this sphere of the community as kind of protected from these powers. But if you are put out, Satan could just take you and like drown you in the next storm or something. He can get you, and you wouldn't have the protection of God anymore. It's very scary the way he presents it. And so to him, the world is so thickly infested and populated with these forces. So I personally don't think that he's a Roman agent or he secretly likes Rome or anything of that sort. I think it's that he thinks all the human forces that are against what he considers to be God and the message he preaches and Christ, they are all being manipulated by the God. He calls him the God of this world. And then in Romans 16, he has a statement right at the end. He says, God will shortly come and crush Satan under his foot. Again, this idea of he's going to crush Satan. So Satan's causing everything. It's a very serious version of the devil made me do it. And then when he's struggling with his own moral struggles, sexual or otherwise, because he's trying to live celibate, and he says, the good that I would, I do not. And he's saying it as a Christian. I take it. I mean, it's present tense. The good that I would, I do not. And the evil that I would not, that I do. And if I do that which I would not, then it is not I that do it, but my flesh. The flesh that Satan is able to manipulate. And he might be talking about sexual desires. That seems the most likely because he uses the word coveting or lusting. And he says, I try, but I can't do it. And then he ends it by saying, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" So you're in a body of death, you're buffeted by Satan. All the angels of Satan are aligned against you, but you can be protected in this realm of the spirit. And then God is going to overthrow this. So I think that might be why he's not so specific in talking about the human agents that killed Jesus. And of course, according to Acts, he's a Roman citizen. He never says that, but in the book of Acts, he is. It may be true, whether he is or not. I don't think he would particularly like the Romans, or certainly not approve of the activities of Caligula, who's a pretty horrible emperor. Claudius is the emperor during most of Paul's activities that we know about. He's usually billed as a good emperor, but you need to read Suetonius and some of the historians. There are no good emperors ever. I mean, if you're talking about murdering people, confiscating their property, torturing people, arresting people without due process, they all did that. It's just that Nero and Caligula were the worst, but Tiberius is horrible. These people, Augustus has a reputation for being a little bit more statesmanlike in this way, but Rome, the Roman imperial cult does whatever it wants. And remember, Sejanus, during the reign of Tiberius, Sejanus is really in charge. People don't even know the name. Look up Sejanus, study Sejanus. He is head of the Praetorian Guard. He increases the numbers manyfold. That's the palace guard. It reminds me kind of Iran today, where you have the Ayatollah, like an emperor, and then you have the Revolutionary Guard guarding him, and it's thousands of people, and they're just like, or Hitler, who had his SS troops. They're sworn to special loyalty just to, protect the emperor, protect the Ayatollah, protect Adolf Hitler, and they'll do anything, and that's their oath. And Sejanus required that of the Praetorian Guard, and he's able to basically, Tiberius is living on caprice, so nobody really cares. He doesn't even, when his mother Livia dies, he doesn't even come to her funeral. He's playing with he's a pedophile, and he has little boys that he likes that swim in his pool on the island of Capri. But Sejanus is running the empire, and he's later taken out. But I guess what I'm trying to say is Paul had his sensitivities and his ethics. He writes very moving things. He says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long suffering, kindness, mercy. He writes that. Those would be the characteristics that Rome would not consider to be the main virtues. Most of those would be weak. You certainly can't run an empire with some of the virtues that Paul, be tender-hearted, forgive one another, put others before yourself, and so forth. So I think maybe he doesn't mention the Romans crucifying Jesus because he thinks they're ultimately pawns in the game. That would be my sense of it. So we can, I don't know, we probably don't want to go too much over an hour, but just not to tire your viewers out too much. But are there any other, we can always revisit this in other ways, but any other, you want me to maybe close, I would say, with the most controversial thing in the book? How about that?
Yeah, let's do that. That sounds great.
Let's do that. Okay. The most controversial thing in the book, and if you get the book, don't go read this chapter first, but it's called The Battle of the Apostles. You alluded to it in your first question. That I stand with Ferdinand Christian Bauer, Okay. There are a lot of Bauers in German theology, but this is F.C. Bauer, 1800s, early 1800s, 19th century, who argued that Paul and James, Paul and the Jerusalem church were split in the lifetime of Paul, that toward the end of his life, he broke with the apostles and went his own way. And this was a view that some held and some were persuaded by Bauer. I mean, we're going back way over 100 years, almost 200 years now, as we get into, the 20th century, 21st century, I mean. So it's very common today. I know a lot of reviewers of my book have said, can you believe Tabor doesn't even know that F.C. Bauer was completely refuted years ago? How could he not have learned that in graduate school? Of course I learned it in graduate school. And then I made the mistake of actually reading F.C. Bauer and being convinced by his arguments, which I guarantee you none of these people have done. They've just been told, oh yeah, Bauer, he was wrong. And that the opponents of Paul were some sort of Gnosticizing Judaizers, but certainly not representing the Jerusalem church. And I think in parts of 2 Corinthians, where Paul begins to talk about, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they apostles? So am I. And I'm a better one, and so forth. This really sharp language that he is talking about the Jerusalem establishment, and that he, for whatever reason, and we don't know all the reasons, decides to go his own independent way. And he does indicate that nobody came to his aid when he was arrested, and when he was taken to Rome. That's not the story we get in Acts. In Acts, we get, he has all this support from the Jewish community, and the Jewish believers, they come and help him and so forth. But he says in Philippians and other places that nobody stood with me, I'm alone. And also talks about people deserting him. So I think at the end, he was lonely, but absolutely convinced that he and Christ had this bond and that he was being faithful to Christ. And I think that accounts for some of the very strong statements that he makes, even as early as Galatians, which is much earlier, where he says, not much earlier, but a few years earlier, I wish those that trouble you would slip with the knife of circumcision, which is kind of a vulgar image there. He says things like that, or let them be damned, let them be accursed, anathema. He's capable of really drawing the line between what he's come to believe is the message he got from Jesus and what others are saying. And so I think there was this break, which I call the Battle of the Apostles. But very few people agree. Some people agree, but most don't. But, in New Testament studies, as you know, from interviewing so many people, we hardly ever agree on much of anything. So, although there are general agreements on some things, I think the apocalypticism is agreed upon by more and more people.
Yeah.
In the field.
I see that.
Not universally. But we get along for the most part, I think, pretty well. So maybe we can take up more things later, but I think this is a good chunk of dealing with Paul and Jesus. You got
Definitely.
the basics, and I enjoyed being with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed having you on. Thank you. Let's do this again sometime soon.
Okay. Thanks, Jacob. Take care.
You too. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.